Good afternoon, colleagues. Can you all hear me? Yeah, good. My name's Dharmendra Kanani. I'm your moderator for this session, and welcome to Friends of Europe debate on investing in a greener urban future. It's all about housing, investment, and low-emission infrastructure. We have a really interesting panel of contributors to this discussion, and hopefully to engage your minds, your hearts and souls on a discussion that's absolutely key if we're going to achieve some of our SDG goals. The clock is ticking. What we do know is that time is running out in a number of ways. I also like to say that this is part of an event which is part of a collaborative that we've created called the Housing Solutions Platform. Hopefully you've got details of it. It's a partnership, a platform that brings together experts from across Europe to think about innovation and innovative solutions to the urgent problem we have about affordable, sustainable housing. But there's more details of that, and if you want to engage with us and find out more, that would be helpful. So turning to the debate at hand. We know, and someone famously, actually I want to start with this quote, which I think is absolutely lovely and frames it quite well in terms of our agenda. The building is a citizen of the city. So the building is a citizen of the city and has an obligation to society. It's quite an interesting quote, an interesting kind of reference point for an entry point for this discussion. We know that buildings in cities account for 50% of emissions and consumption of energy. And we also know that actually majority of the buildings that we need for 2050 have not even been built yet. We also know there's a kind of economic divide or a poverty trap, that actually some of our poorest communities across Europe and beyond live in the poorest housing and the most unsustainable housing. And actually there's an urgent need to look at that particular agenda when we think of the impact of climate change and what is happening in and around us almost on a daily basis. When you just witness the weather that we've had, or the weather crisis that we've had across the globe, it's often the poorest communities that are hit, both with insurance and the inability to be housed, and actually for whole communities to be absolutely displaced. But in this context, what we want to discuss is where are we? Where are we on this agenda broadly, globally, but also across Europe? Europe has made a huge advance on climate change activity. It's proven the case that actually you can act on climate change whilst also increasing GDP growth. So the argument, the business case is there, but actually political will and investment are two key drivers in ensuring how we get to a more sustainable housing future for all communities across Europe and beyond. So I want to start with a contribution from Raf Toots, who's the Director of Programme Division at UN Habitat. Raf, can you give us a sense of where we're at? What's the kind of sense of the dashboard in terms of where we've got to so far, and what you think the hurdles are ahead in terms of this sustainable housing agenda? And in particular, perhaps you might want to draw reference to what you think are some of the big challenges ahead of us, at least in the next 10 years.
Thank you. I'm actually here not only on behalf of my own organization, which is UN Habitat, but also other UN agencies that are working on the same topic of sustainable cities, like UN Environment, UNIDO, and so on. And increasingly, we are working more and more together to address these issues, because, as the moderator suggested, the challenge is huge. In fact, the way we look at green cities is we take it one step higher to start with. Fundamentally, sustainable urbanization is a response to business as usual urbanization, which has not gone in the right direction during the last couple of decades, leading to social fragmentation, toxic environments that are not environmentally friendly, and also not economically productive. So, in fact, we're looking at better forms of urbanization that are also greener and that are also more environmental friendly. So, in effect, a better urban future should also be a greener urban future. And greener would be just one of the entry points for sustainable urbanization. In fact, the new urban agenda that has been adopted in 2016 is an implementation instrument of the SDGs, specifically focusing on how cities can support implementation of sustainable development. And the new urban agenda focuses very strongly that don't go straight to the cities. You have to act at the national level as well as at the city level to make lasting change. You need national urban policies with green entry points. You need planning systems, you need legislation and local finance systems, and lots of local capacity to then implement different types of entry points to greener cities. But without these fundamentals, it's very, very hard to reach any scale and to reach any impact. I'm now going to give you a few examples of our work and how we address this. One is housing. The moderator has explained housing is a big challenge, is a big opportunity. Typically, when you look at housing regulations, you can look at trying to lift the bottom, meaning trying to improve, increase the quality of the regulations. That's what we're doing in many countries, including in Africa. Also trying to lift the ceiling, that means encourage excellence in green buildings and green housing, but also try to invest in certain areas that can really make a difference, such as social housing. And we're working, for instance, in India, trying to influence the people who are designing and implementing social housing to make it sustainable, to integrate sustainability elements in social housing in a large country like India. Another initiative that we are doing together with ICLEI, one of the larger, as you know, NGOs, local government associations working in this field, is called Urban LEDs, Low Emission Development Strategies. That's a different approach. You're looking at the city as a whole. You're looking at vertical integration between the relevant ministry, the relevant national frameworks, for instance, for climate action, and the city, and then you identify what are the key points that can trigger change in a city. And this could be, for instance, we are working with them in Brazil, in Recife, where green roofs, a regulation to make green roofs mandatory in certain buildings can be a trigger for change. Or non-motorized transport, or something to do with solid waste or green. But you're looking for triggers to go for a much more holistic approach of change at the city level. And maybe the final example I would like to use is the work that we are starting with UN Environment, where we're looking at integration in terms of sustainable landscapes, the city-region planning dimension, as well as integrating infrastructure, different components of infrastructure to create synergy at the city level. Now, one of the elements, the key questions of this panel is finance and investment, because when all these plans are ready, when all these ideas are lined up, how do you finance them? And there, for us, it's very clear that you must start with tapping on local finance. You need to build the local resource mobilization capacity first. Then you look at transfers between local and national to see how they can be improved, maybe with a group of cities. Then you look at certain specific target groups. For instance, water operators. How can you make water operators, these are large companies, how can you make them more sustainable in delivering their mandate? Another element is land value sharing and land value capture. How can you use increased land value to invest in green infrastructure? It's a lot of potential, but very difficult to do. And finally, and this is where most people think of first, I think, is how can you use subsidies, targeted subsidies, to trigger other private and public investment. And some of the funds that we all know, the Green Climate Fund, some of the funds organized by the European Commission are trying to do that, World Bank also, to find a catalytic entry point for private and public investment. So I'll leave it here, moderator.
Okay,
Yeah.
can I just push you on a couple of points? One thing is about, you say it's important to tap into local finance. What do you mean by that? And then I'd like you to pull out a bit, because what you've described is very good in terms of the how and the potential how. But I think people want to know, given the clock is ticking, if you are asked, what's the kind of scorecard now, where we stand given what you do, are we 30% there, 20% there? Is the pace the right pace?
Definitely we're not where we need to be, and there's major differences between the regions and between the countries. Some regions and countries have started with this agenda 30, 40 years ago. Others are just starting now. But, well, to give you the example of local finance, you know there are cities that have municipal budgets of less than $100 per capita per year. So what can you do with $100 if you want to invest in green infrastructure? So there's still, of course, there's socioeconomic dynamics, but there's still a lot of untapped local resources that can be mobilized. And that's the basis for everything, because if you don't have a sound municipal finance system, any grants that will come to you, and I'm talking now about least developed countries and developing countries, any grants to sustain them and any loans to repay them, you need a very sound municipal finance system. And I don't think any green cities can exist without a sound municipal finance system.
Okay. What levers do you use to progress change on this agenda from your perspective as a UN Habitat? What are the levers that you can that are available to you to kind of get greater progress? Are there any?
Well, we try to move from a confrontational approach between, I think as a UN agency, we're well placed to link cities with national governments. We have good access to national governments, and all the UN agencies have. And we try to move from a kind of confrontational political attitude towards investing in cities to a more collaborative attitude. And I think we can make a difference there, to try to say, this is for not for anyone's short-term political gain, but for the long-term interest of the population. And whether you're a citizen of a certain city, you're still a citizen of the same country, and the investment goes to the long-term sustainability of the whole nation.
No, absolutely, and I take your point about consensus building, but there's a sense that actually there's a yawning gap in terms of what we know needs to be invested now, but into the next 10 years, this multi-billion yawning gap. And we know that actually political leadership is what it is currently in Europe and the globe on this agenda. But I'm sure, you know, those seem to be the two pivot points that we need to be thinking about if we're going to escalate or progress on this agenda fundamentally. I mean, you can respond to that, but I was...
Well, it's not only billions, it's trillions, actually.
Yes, it's trillions.
It's trillions. It's 4.5 trillion a year.
Yes.
That's the investment that is needed for sustainable urban development for the next 20 years. 4.5 trillions a year. Now, this investment is going to take place anyway. It's a matter of how to increase the quality, how to influence this investment. It's not to raise this investment. Most of it is private sector investment in housing and infrastructure. But how to raise the quality and how to make sure that you don't need to retrofit it after 10 or 20 years.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you for that point. I'm going to turn to you, Judith. Judith Kim from the chair of the Architects Council of Europe. Now,
Sustainability Group, not the whole of the Architects Council.
Of course, absolutely.
Thank you, though.
Let me just give you, absolutely, give this quote. So, to keep global warming below 2 degrees, right, we need to renovate 250 million homes across Europe by 2050, right? That's more than twice as many currently projected. And we actually need a different approach to how the wisdom and advice and the practice of architects is actually central to some of this agenda in terms of how we build and the pace at which we build sustainable housing and structures. Over to you. What's your sense of that, given the role that you play?
Thank you very much for that introduction and for your question. To give you a little bit of background, so the Architects Council of Europe is a not-for-profit organization. We represent the interests of over 500,000 architects, well over 500,000 architects across Europe. We work very closely with our 43 member organizations in 31 countries, and we develop positions and campaigns to overcome the barriers of creating a better and healthier and lower energy intensive environment. And so we also promote the role of architecture in obviously achieving this. And we often feel that that architecture has a transformative role, but it often takes a back seat in terms of accelerating the retrofit rates and also accelerating the transformation of the broader built environment. So we are highly trained professionals. We are not terribly technical, so we're not your very detailed technical experts, but we are generalists who pull together lots of different expert opinion to create a spatial, material, and often unique configuration that people then continue to live, work, and function in. And what's really important is we think that architects are pretty much the only actors who champion the needs of the end user. And in that sense, we often find ourselves alone. And I think it is not helped by the current legislative status quo. So what tends to happen in building legislation, which is one of the biggest motivators for change at the moment in the construction sector, is that legislation tends to be very technically based, looking at individual disciplines. There is a lot of legislation relating to products and materials. There is legislation regarding the practice of building. However, it all relates to a single point in a building's life cycle, and it's often based on not actual performance, but theoretical performance. So if you remember the Volkswagen scandal, where what we found out is the way in which legislation was set up is not relating to the real performance of cars on the road as they are driven. And we are experiencing a similar problem in the construction sector. And we see this as a major barrier to targeting investment to make productive changes. So at the moment, there are no requirements for checking, once a building is built and occupied, how our design expectations actually live up to, so how the buildings live up to our expectations once they're occupied and run. And as I said before, we're also targeting a single point in the life cycle. So we're missing out operational, end of life, and not only that, but we're also missing out other aspects of building performance, which relate to health and well-being, which relates to the material impacts themselves, water consumption. We do not look at climate change resilience, and we also don't look at the value. So all of these things, if at all considered, are done in very siloed expert groups that do not come back into the design and valuation process. Therefore, we actually lack a link, an understanding between the spatial quality of a building, the health and well-being of the occupants in them, and the resources that it requires to actually create and run and maintain that environment. And this is a really critical barrier, and we do as much work as we can with the Commission, with MEPs, with our member organizations to draw attention to this and try and transform legislation and reporting metrics to make that work. And the challenge is really enormous because we have to find a way to deliver better, more healthy environments with less and less and less resources. And unfortunately, at a time of growing commoditization of buildings, the pressure is on the other side. So on the ground, when you're trying to realize these improved designs, once you go through a value engineering, once certain things are not included in the briefing documents, things are then not included in the contractor's requirements, then they are not done at commissioning stages, then they are not done in operating cycles, we increase the risk of buildings not performing as we expect them to do. So the ACE is really promoting. We're throwing down the gauntlet to all of us and to the Commission and to our member organizations to promote a more holistic approach. So holistic in the sense of considering more than just energy at the point of design. We want to consider more resources, i.e. the materials and the products incorporated in buildings, the water consumption, the indoor environmental quality, and climate change adaptation, etc., and value together from the start of the building and across the whole life cycle. Now, people would normally say, do we really want to collect so much data about buildings? It isn't, you know, unfortunately, data collection has acquired a bad name in construction. Data is being collected everywhere around us and is being used to extremely positive effects, also, as we know, not so positive ones, but definitely transformative. So what we really want to do is give data power, transformative power, to designers, to clients, to investors, to contractors, to building operators, to get a handle on what it is that works, what is the real value of it, and how we can create that transformation to be more rapid. So, for example, there is a big debate about creating retrofits. A lot of retrofit programs have taken place across Europe. I know of one particular research that shows that when you do very specific energy efficiency targeting retrofits, the improvements that they achieve are not huge, ultimately. We need to create deep retrofits that transform, that reduce consumption by more than 30–40% in the existing stock, and these measures are piecemeal. So when you are taking all the finishes, all the wiring, everything out of a building to refit that building, it is the best time to create a functional improvement at the same time. And we're lacking this joined-up approach between spatial interventions and performative interventions. Moreover, our concept of what performance is very limited. So we would like to very much change that, so focusing on actual rather than theoretical performance, support more research into also the impact of architectural quality on things that are other than specific environmental aspect, but relate to the well-being and productivity of occupants, which we believe is extremely important. So we know, for example, that studies into the architecture's capacity to expand lifespan of people. It has been shown to improve attainment in schools, to reduce incarceration rates in mental hospitals, improving productivity in office buildings. And these are all things that are actually untouched because we're not focusing on operation in use, because of buildings' performance in use. So all of that useful feedback is lost. We would also like to see a lot more coordination between different EU ministries, so DG Culture, DG Environment, DG Grow, DG Energy. We have seen one of the most productive or one of the most interesting and promising programs coming out of this type of collaboration, which is called the Levels Program, and I'm sure James and others might touch on this.
What's it called again?
Levels. EU Levels Program, and I'll let someone else talk about
it. I have to say, I mean, we all live with stereotypes, but your picture of architects as the selfless social movement wanting to create good is not something which we would ordinarily come across, at least myself anyway. So it's good to hear, without being critical, obviously, that it's not all about the money and commerce. But are you suggesting that actually the construction lobby clearly has greater power than you do? Is that the bottom line here? Because legislation serves a particular purpose. It has a purpose in terms of the role that government has for the safety, the rule of law, etc. And what you're saying is that actually, given what you said about the need for change, and the pace of change is also absolutely essential here, both in renovation and new buildings, that the regulation or the legislation is actually hindering progress, because it's tilted in one direction.
It's a very good question. I mentioned the commoditization of buildings. That is very true. But what I'm saying is actually nobody has the power, because neither the developers, neither the contractors, neither the financiers, because nobody has the data about what really works. So we as architects often find ourselves in the crosshairs of all of this discussion without the equipment, without the evidence and the data to say, well, actually, this is this is important for this and this reason, this is worth this much. If you cut this out of this project, then it will have that much implications on the maintenance costs. It will have this implications of how resilient this will be. You're going to have to refit this whole building in 5 years' time with air conditioning if you don't design it like this. We simply haven't got the mechanisms in the system at the moment to be able to create these responses rapidly enough or to be even asked for it. And that's a really, really big problem.
Indeed. Do you feel that you've got the business case made? Because when you mention holistic, policymakers and decision makers run to the bunker and say, oh my God, that sounds really woolly and vague and we can't do that. And everyone wants, government departments, or in this case, director generals of different DGs to actually connect more and work more collaboratively. If ever it was thus, it's always been the question that could there be a more agile, more connected set of discussions amongst DGs. But how do we overcome?
I think the business case is there for doing it right, because just in the energy sector.
I don't mean that. Yeah. I don't mean the emotional, moral business.
No.
I mean, what's the because construction people and politicians will be worried about the bottom red line, i.e., is it going to kind of imbalance the economy? Are we going to reduce the investment of building producers in an area because we are going to over-regulate, for example? And actually, we want to have quick buildings out the door so we can deal with the burgeoning population.
Well, there are two sides to this.
Right.
One, we want buildings to perform better. So we need to define what we mean by performing better properly, actually, in use. We want to regulate things that matter rather than things that are theoretical. We're giving legislation a bad name at the moment because what we are regulating is often not very closely related to real life. And that's a problem. So the danger, the risk there is you're targeting trillions, as you say, in investment towards things and measures that do not work. And ultimately, you're just pushing impacts down the life cycle stages. So I can do a building that has an absolutely minimal embodied carbon. It has absolutely minimal energy consumption, but it will take so much money to maintain, and it will also mean that people in that building will be not so happy that it's pointless to do it because you'll be back to square one. So what we are trying to do is not target investment to create a time bomb. And there is a real danger of that. So we know the scale of the performance gap in some of the countries where this has been measured in terms of energy consumption, that buildings consume, and often the smarter and the more automated buildings consume between 2 to 3 times more energy than assumed during design stages. And we cannot have that.
So where does the problem lie? Because you need somebody to be the lead actor here, to kind of bring these parts together, given where we find ourselves, given what you just said. Is it the absence of political leadership in the union? Is it about civil servants not getting it? Which is it? Or is it both? I
think that the problem is the inertia. I think the Commission would probably like to do more than it's doing already. It's often hit, and often the MEPs have enabled this, but sometimes it's the nation states that are compromising some of the more forward-looking agreements. It is sometimes difficult to make those agreements.
The old hoary chestnut of subsidiarity. Yes.
But you do need extremely strong vision, and you need to promote that vision really energetically and actively. And it isn't rocket science. It just seems so because we often haven't got the right data to put it on the table on the day.
Yes, I totally agree with you about the holistic approach and the data, but if only data itself would actually shift the minds of politicians and the inertia. But I think you're right. It is as a point of understanding what the future trajectory is, but also the cost-benefit analysis of not doing anything. So let's come back to them.
And also the cost of getting it wrong. And we have those figures in some areas, and that argument can be made.
I'm sure people in the audience hopefully will come back to some of this discussion. Let's go to the city level. Piero, Chief Resilience Officer, City of Milan. I said earlier in my introductory remarks that buildings in cities account for nearly 50% of the EU's energy consumption, over a third of its CO2 emission. And what we do know is that basically most of the world population will live in cities in the next 50 years. Absolutely the case. They're going to become megacities, and we know, those of you who've been to Milan, it's huge, it's burgeoning, it's fit to burst to a certain extent. But we know that cities will house 2/3 of the global population by 2050. what are you doing as Chief Resilience Officer in Milan on this particular agenda? And what's your sense of common purpose at a municipal level for making this happen, or what you see as the barriers or the levers that you can hold on to get traction on this agenda?
Yes. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. First of all, before to answer you back, because we are organized by the Friend of Europe, I will all ask you to join me in an applause for the mayor of Thessaloniki, that last Sunday was attacked by a group of fascists and Russians. And the European Union was built over and against the fascism and Russians. And if we want to create a greener and sustainable urban future, first of all, we should be working on democracy. And any attack against any public servant or civil servant by a Russian or a fascist should be condemned, and we should be fighting against this. So please round me an applause for the mayors of Thessaloniki.
Indeed.
Thank you very much, because Thessaloniki is also a member of the 100 Resilient Cities, so it's one of our partners. And actually what we are doing every day is a good question. What is doing a Chief Resilience Officer? We are trying to make the complexity something easier, and the holistic approach something real. That's, we always speak about silos. We always speak that we are working in a public administration or in an urban area where there is the silos are like the main barriers. Even when you're like colleagues, you don't know what he's doing close to each other. And I'm trying today to explain how we try to overcome, specifically on this issue. Just last Saturday, we have presented a new master plan for the city of Milan. The new master plan has four main objectives, 4 pillars. One of the pillars is to create a sustainable, ecological, and resilience Milan. And there is 3 objectives on this. First is to reduce the soil consumption, -4%. That in a time when the city is growing, we have like an increase of 30,000 people coming to the city every year, that they need house, they need place to work, they need services, they need infrastructures. We want to reduce the consumption of soil, so -4%, working on the brown field and not anymore in the green field as urban development. The second is to create the new 20 parks, green parks in the cities. And we are now to launch next Friday the new urban forest program. As London, as Paris, we are moving to create a national park within, well, metropolitan park as we call it, within the city of Milan. But how? And this has come to the question and the answer of today. How? There is a new article on the rules of the master plan for the future buildings. It's named Sustainable and Resilience Building. So when we look at the buildings, we're not looking at the buildings anymore as an energy standard, but we integrate the green infrastructures and the water management process in the new standard. Because we want to move up to the nearly zero building, so the new building we're going to design the next 12 years should be not look at the European standard, but we will move forward than the European standard. Because it's the vision that we create. It's the city, it's the enabler of changes. It's the city that have to create now, has to driven the market and not following the market as was in the last 20 years. Because we can set the rules that could identify the big changes in the future, and especially for building and, as you said, the built environment again, around the building itself. So in this new code, for all the people that are going to retrofitting a building with not the deeper innovation, going over the deeper innovation, there will be incentives in terms of fiscal and in terms also on, let's say, administrative procedure. So that we facilitate the administrative procedure if they are integrated with the built environment, with the green infrastructures, with the natural-based solution, with the green roof. Because the green roof, or whatever it is, the vertical garden, it becomes an element to improve, to reduce, or to improve the air quality of the cities, to improve the livability of our cities, and also help us to manage the impact of climate change in terms of the flash flooding and whatever. At the same time, we are now to launch, when you speak about local finance, well, with some EU rules and national rules, for a city as Milan, it's not really easy to create some new financial instrument, because we are obliged to not spend. We have to limit our debts in somehow. That could be true, could be right, I don't know. But if we need to change and we need to move to retrofit all the buildings, we should have more capability to spend. But we have now created a new fund It's 24 million with a collaboration of private sector. So we're going to reach 120 million euro in the next 3 years for private buildings, and the incentives.
For private buildings, you say?
Private buildings,
private
not
buildings.
public. So we are going to retrofit private buildings and using public money. And it's 3 kind of incentives. 5% of incentives if you do only the heating system, 15% if you do deep renovation, 20% if you do heating, deep renovation, and green infrastructures in the building. So we set the rules, we set the money to improve the integration, the holistic approach, so the resilience of the cities, to make all the new future urban development integrated with the green, with the efficiency, and with the resilience in terms of dealing with the impact of climate change in terms of heat waves and flash flooding. So in somehow, we as a cities, we look ourselves as an enabler, as a player ourselves, because we also need to work on our public buildings, and we are doing together with our community on this. But we also want to driven the market. Just yesterday, I've met with an energy utilities. They come to me and offer and look to present their new offers for energy efficiency in building. And it was pretty funny because there was heating, deep renovation, and they say, oh, this is all for climate change. And they say, yes, but where is water? And where is green in your offers? Because you want to create value over where you generate value, but you are not including in the value that you generate the SDG, so water and greening on that. So we also need that the private sector is moving forward and looking more at the social impact of your offers and not only to the private, their own profit somehow. Because this is something that is really essential. And the other things that we are trying to do is to look out of the box in the communication process. So basically we are trying not to attend, like the EU Green Week, just because we are here, but we are more to looking to attend like the Design Week or the Fashion Week. The Design Week especially, it's specifically for us in the city of Milan, is in a week we have 1.5 million people coming to the cities speaking about design. Design is meaning materials, is meaning technology, is meaning a new way of thinking the built environment. And if we are capable to speak with the designer and the materials designer, we make what you were asking before, that we can integrate even what is the other thing, the materials, the furniture in the urban environment built in a different way. And this is also something that is related to something that is a topic in Europe, that is the security issue. When we speak about security and we need to protect our cities with concrete barriers or something, making that in a more livable or more accessible way, it does make the difference, and you're still being compliant with a demand of population to feel more safer due to other risks and general. So this is also the way how we think that we can deal with the security, not with the military, even if it's necessary sometimes, but more with the livable cities, because we are designing a more city that is more green, more resilient, and more sustainable, especially for our citizens, because at the end of the day, we are working for our citizens and not for ourselves. So that's what we are trying to do as Milan and as 100 Resilient Cities Network, and if you want to know what I'm doing every day, I mean, we are 87 people doing my job at the moment. We are a family around and globally. We know that if we are capable to put the holistic approach in the public administration, we can make the difference not for the next 5 years, but the next 50 years. So what we are trying to do is try to be like a plumber, like to try to solve the problem like make people speaking together.
No, indeed, and you know, everyone needs a plumber. They're always often a scarce and highly valued. But can I just push you, because what you presented, I think it's good, absolutely good, and I'm not making any pejorative comment in that regard. But I'm not getting a sense of what the under the skin issues are. Now, I understand you're a public servant and you're in Milan, but it sounds a bit too good to be true. What I would like to know is, actually, is the political governance behind you? You don't have a budget, clearly, but you're 24 million for private sector buildings. Great. I think it's a good way to actually, how do you create market and use market and economics to nudge the behavior of construction? But this is a drop in the ocean when you think about your budget in Milan for what's required. So it would be good to understand a little bit more, if you can share, about what you think are the obstacles in your way that you actually, or what are the issues that you're confronting that's not making the progress at the pace it should be? And I suppose, given what's happened in Italy most recently, the politics, do you see that affecting what you're going to be able to do?
I'm going to answer to the second one, and it's. I'm a public servant, I'm not a politician, so at the moment we are still in a political debate about the government, so because we don't have a government, as Germany didn't have for 6 months, so I think we are still compliant with German approach during the last election. And, but anyway, in terms of it's too good, I mean, it's not too good. What is happened during the last 7 years in the cities, but I would say the last 20 years in the cities, that like a community of private community, citizen, NGO, stop complaining and start thinking how they can improve the life and the quality of living in the cities. So instead to look at the barriers, they start to looking at the solution. And we know that we have a lot of barriers, but we find a way to get 24 million, and we get free financial partners that are coming to us that rise to 120 million.
Sure.
And we have a joint private committee. We are now designing a communication campaign. It was funny because with my colleagues, the marketing, the territorial marketing director, say, I proposed him, well, let's design a communication campaign with all the energy company saying all these energy players want to change the cities together with us. And he told me, oh, you will never make it because, you know, the energy company want to defend their own business. But we have seen that now it's happened. So it's, I think that barriers, it's in our minds, and we should focus more on what we could do it instead to think what is the barriers. We know what is the barriers. Are the money and the legislation and maybe like the behavior of the community. But look, we had an experience thanks to the European Union and the Lighthouse program, is a sharing cities program. We had to retrofit 21,000 square meters. It takes us 6 months. Of delivering 6 months of co-design. And the main essential element was not the technology, was not the solution, was not the materials, was not the financial, was how we approach the community. And we asked the community not only which is your barriers, your needs, but which is your desire, what you're looking for. And once you work with the people, try to create a vision with the people take the risk together with you. So I think it's sometimes, instead to ask what is your problem, and we should ask the people what you want, which is your vision, and you go back to the ground, you make the difference in somehow. So there will be some problem in implementing this project. We know that we need more money, that is what we have it, but we start. And then we hope that with this example, maybe other private investors, and to honestly, when you say social housing, we have so many private investors come to Milan asking us to invest, to deliver social housing and not private buildings. Mm-hmm. Because they understand there is new market and new potential there. Even the private sectors now is moving in this direction. Well, so I'm confident on this. And we should be more confident and positive on this approach, in my opinion.
I mean, given the growing population, and Milan is obviously an example where you've got both new migrants there, you've also got a large youth population and a growing population. I suppose the issue about social housing is key, because what we're witnessing across Europe is 18 to 25-year-olds are basically priced out of the private sector market and are having to either live outside of the city or live in social housing or shared housing. And I will move on, I promise you, but do you feel you've got the political support at a local level for your agenda?
Oh, totally. We have totally support. Our mayor has 3 main objectives in his agenda, mm-hmm. Since I was appointed after he was in the office. The first one is to become more attractive from the international level, to improve, to bring the quality of living in the peri-urban area of the city. So we have a new plan of 300 million euro of project, not of thinking of project to deliver in the peri-urban area, so not in the city center, looking at the social inclusion of the people. And the third one is climate change and environment. Together with Ms. Hidalgo in Paris, they are leading the C40 network and the other resilient cities. And we are all looking at this as an opportunity. And even if you're not considered for environment or the quality, you can consider for the business continuity. Because if you want to be attractive for investors, for a company that comes and makes your urban economy, the business continuity in terms of infrastructures, in terms of offers, is essential for a city to become something like that. So the environment and climate change is now considered in our agenda as an important business opportunity for the others. And this makes also sense.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for responding to my questions, which were obviously motivated to create debate as you, and thought. I'm not sure if I can't see people with mics. Are there people with mics around in the room? Oh, that's a pity. I was hoping to engage you in this conversation. I'm doing this because the lights are really... there's a gentleman there in the white... Is it a gentleman, young woman in a white T-shirt? Great. Before I move to you, James, I mean, I'm just disrupting the flow, only because I want to, and I think I want to engage you in terms of any reactions you have to what you've heard so far, any questions that emerge in your mind, because I want to kind of create a bit of a debate around this. Say who you are, would you, if you represent anybody.
Russell Mills, representing SIF, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. A question, it's partly to Judith, partly to Raf, I think. I think, Raf, you said some cities have started this 40 years ago, and I think, Judith, you mentioned the most important thing you're missing is evidence on what can be done. Isn't there an opportunity for you two guys to talk or find those champions? I mean, maybe there's a champion in Milan, maybe there's a champion in Paris, maybe a few others, but isn't there an opportunity to do something both at the unofficial level but also the official level to try and get that connectivity between those who've done it for 40 years and those who just need evidence of how it's actually done?
It's a very well-made point, actually, in the fact that you've got new infrastructure, the 100 resilient cities. It's an infrastructure that actually people should be making use of. So over to you, Sue. Raf, do you want to go first, please?
Yes, certainly there are stories that date back to 30, 40 years. I'm thinking of city of Malmö, for instance, in Sweden. I think it's a good example. And if you then hear some of the early mayors and how they created the change and how they sustained the change across different political cycles and economic cycles and social troubles in the city, then you're really talking about true sustainability. To really pursue an agenda for 40 years over through different cycles, I think this is commendable. Now, there's a lot of wisdom in these leaders of these cities, but every city will have to find its own way. It's not going to be a copy-paste. It's not going to be good practices that is immediately transferable. Every city has its own context, its own political situation, its own environmental situation, which makes it unique. But you can definitely learn. And you learn best from cities which have similar maybe issues or have similar potentials. And I think that's what we try to do, to bring cities together, not necessarily from superficially similar, but who have fundamentally similar issues and similar potentials.
Thank you. Well, we're very happy to talk.
It happened here first, where it was great. A relationship in the making.
Thank you for the question. I think secondly, so one critical aspect of success stories is the role of feedback in development. So you start something and then you monitor how it goes and then you put the learning back into practice and then you monitor how that goes. And it is, in terms of my points about collecting the right data and going after evidence, is to install a culture of feedback. In architecture, traditionally, we used to have very good feedback from our feedback loop with our clients. So architects used to be involved from the beginning, from the inception of a project all the way to delivery. And one of the things that have happened through this commoditization process was that architects now often are disconnected from their end product. It would be unheard of in any other design discipline to miss out on the feedback that you get from your completed product in use. It is not conducive. It's not conducive also for legislation. So if you create legislation and you cannot tell how well it's working on the ground, and except what you can tell that it's not going fast enough, but you haven't got the resolution in your feedback to understand what to change, it's not helpful. I was very impressed when, Pierre, you were saying that you start off asking your city inhabitants, about what, or in the neighborhood inhabitants, what it is that they actually want. Because once people want something, it's very easy to create it in a way that it actually is done with less use of natural resources and less environmental impact. But if you're just trying to reduce the environmental impact on its own, it's considered a burden. And I think as architects and designers, another point that you made very well, we want to move away from this activity being a burden, and we want to fill it with optimism and capability and winning.
Thank you. I'm happy to take one more comment or query from the audience. Lady over there. Mic people? Just over here on the left, please. Lady in the black jumper.
It's
say who you are if you're representing anybody, please.
Antonia from the German Housing, representing public and private housing association. And I'm wondering, because the biggest problem in Germany, and I guess it's in most of the countries in Europe, in the big cities and urban areas, we lack actually capacity of housing at all, and we lack especially capacity of social housing. And I think there's some contradiction here, because people think first about like having it at home at all, so not about like living in a house which is energy efficient. So if the energy efficiency, increasing costs of building and like increasing capacity of housing, how do you solve that?
Okay. Who would like to come back on that? Because I mean, it goes back to your question earlier that we were having. I mean, you were mentioning, Judith, it's that the business case has to be that doing this and doing this right is not going to be more expensive, and actually has to be economically viable. And we having this conversation, just with a different conversation about greener cities just before this, and the sense that people are generally understanding of the impact of climate change, but they won't defer their gratification. I still want to consume. I want to have a cheap home. I don't want to I want my disposable income not to be more on my rent or a more costly home, but actually for me to be able to do the things that I enjoy and need and want in my life. So how do we kind of tripwire that debate that actually deferred gratification is a key issue for us, but cost is a big driver on this agenda? Do you want to come on this, Piero?
Just to tell a story.
Okay.
It's quite a story really explained. It's also a story that's more efficient. I mean, really explained very well. We were a couple of years ago doing like a co-design process with in a public residential building. It was a public building, and the public residential buildings comes an old ladies comes to me and say, I don't mind about energy efficiency. I don't need it. I need the bar in the window because I don't feel safe because there are the strangers close to my house. And there was with the deputy mayor of social housing with me, and he answered back, say, hey, madam, we will do it. We will put a bar for you, but not because of the strangers, because during the night, when there is a heat waves, you can sleep with the window open without opening the air conditioning. And you're basically doing both. You are improving, and so giving the energy efficiency, but you also create a more safety, and you are giving like a housing and that perspective to the people. So it's a matter also how you explain things.
Yeah, but that's a lovely story, but that doesn't deal with the issue of cost. Because if that lady thinks it's going to cost me more, I'm not going to have it.
The cost, it's basically that you are not only looking at the building, but also at the behavior of the people after it when you're designing a building. Because the European Commission and all the national legislation during 10 years, they were looking so much on energy efficiency that at the end they realized that there is heat waves. And then now our house is more like an oven than a real production. So the people that see all the standards are improving the performance of the building, but not reducing the consumption of the people because they are not working on the behavior. And this is where there's a failure of the cost. And the failure of the cost, when we talk about waste, if we are not improving the waste, the cost of waste, the price of waste, we will never make the recycling efficient. So it's the cost. It's not a real issue in terms of things if you are including different elements, so like the social behavior and the community behavior on that. So in the building we are designing, that building, we are going to save 80% of the building. So the payback time for the local authorities, together with the incentives that we have from the national government, is like 7 up to 8 years. So where is the cost? It's a revolving fund, basically. We create with a building. So it's a matter how you think. You is totally right.
But people might say actually it's about how you communicate it, but also it can be sounding preachy to say actually it's about changing behaviour. And when you're talking about people, especially, and it's not about class or economics actually. The people across the spectrum, whether they have money or not, understand it. In their head to a certain extent, but behaviour doesn't change. But how do you find the levers to enable people through peer group development or community development or other processes, or even the kind of the pricing of issues can have a behaviour change aspect? And actually saying that actually we need just to have behaviour change on its own right is not going to be good enough.
I just want to finish on a thing. So okay. Just another little story. We have like a city in South Africa, Cape Town, is without water, right? And we have other cities in Australia that are without water every day. And when you speak with some developers that work in Italy or in Europe and in Australia, and you ask about the water business model, speaking about cost, they always answer, in Australia the business model is quite easy because the cost of water is so high, so you make the revenue out of that. But in a country as Italy, when you give for free, the people are using to use more water than they needed, and the cost is increasing. So there is not benefit in doing the water management in a better way because there is not a business model. So again, the natural resources should have a higher value on this.
Absolutely. James, you've been very patient. Thank you very much. But I wanted to engage our people here. You represent the World Green Building Council. You're regional director, and I do want you to tell me what you think a green building is, because that's one of the issues I think it's important for us to understand. But we know, RAF pointed to the fact there's 4.6 trillion being invested in construction. Only 10% of that is going in energy efficiency, energy efficient buildings. So where's the private sector on this? Okay.
So in terms of scaling up investment, by the way, I feel I found a friend here. I love this point about let's focus on solutions and not barriers to this. So I'll come to how do we scale up investment in a moment. I think creating market frameworks that are aligned globally and in Europe is one of the key things that we're trying to do in the World Green Building Council. So our network spans these non-profits called Green Building Councils in 70+ countries, and an industry membership of around 50,000. And some of the things that we're trying to do are, pushing on the agenda to deliver net zero buildings globally, for example, which we know we need to massively scale up. And our kind of vision for market transformation involves both the kind of industry leadership programs, those voluntary, certifications where the market defines a standard, but then we raise awareness. We build skills and capacity. We build the financial and economic mechanisms to actually scale a market, and we start working on the policy and regulatory design to help that market stabilize and scale longer term. So I think a really important point when we're talking about any of this is finding solutions across those cross-cutting areas. That's absolutely key.
And also cross-cutting sectors, because you're referring to public sector and private sector there.
Yes, okay. Yeah, absolutely. For us, that's the name of the game. You do think these things cross-sectorally. I think for Europe, a really specific challenge we've been set by the new Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is for each of our nations to put in place a long-term, ambitious national building renovation strategy, and also specifically to scale up investment. And my point is, for a proper functioning market, you need those awareness-raising programs to drive demand, the capacity-building programs, financial and economic and policy interventions and solutions. And what we found, so we've run a program for the last few years called Build Upon, is you look at a typical member state, and there's around 100 major programs. These are programs backed by often millions of euros of public funding or private sector funding that are tackling each of those barriers, that are providing solutions. But what we see today is there isn't a strategy to make that cohesive. So take a member state, 100 major initiatives tackling those barriers, including scaling up finance. You don't employ a team of 100 staff and then say, don't speak to each other, don't work together. And I think that's a really big job when we're talking cross-sectoral action, is we've got a lot of the solutions in place that tackle each of those intervention areas. I don't like writing market barrier reports anymore. We should ban that. We've got these solutions. We've actually mapped out over 1,000 of them across Europe in this project the last few years. They aren't joined up to really make a market. That's a really, really key...
Who needs to do the joining up?
Key challenge. So we've worked with governments in 13 countries across Europe, a coalition of 2,000 organisations, and we've mapped out the key voices from the building and construction sector to the utilities, the financial institutions, local, national government, energy agencies, citizen groups. We've tried to map out who are the voices at the table, and when we work with governments, local and central, on designing those renovation strategies, we think we need a balance at the table. So we talk a lot about measuring energy performance. We measure how many of those groups are coming to the table to work on co-design and implementation. That's something we're really pursuing, and that's going to be a really big challenge moving forwards. I'm going to come back to a question about what's a green building, if I may, in a second. But I said something very unpopular at a conference in Greece the other day, which is I think you can have too much innovation. And on finance, I know I've been involved in designing several unsuccessful, innovative energy efficiency in buildings financing schemes because consumers just didn't understand them at the end of the day.
But were these about consumers rather than producers?
So this was about getting finance into more lower carbon buildings.
Right.
At the end of the day, end goal. We've designed innovative schemes that haven't engaged consumers. At the start of our process a few years ago, working to scale up building renovation and finance, people said the retail banks aren't at the table. So we spent several years looking at what does a retail bank, mortgage lenders particularly, count as success? How do you talk about mortgage performance, and how can you link building sustainability performance metrics, lower costs, links to lower probability of default of borrowers? Assets that retain their value better over time in a market that's becoming more sustainable, improved loan-to-value ratios for lenders. So we've started to try to speak the same language and build green and energy efficiency metrics into the metrics used by major mortgage lenders. And next month, we're releasing a pilot with about 20 major European banks to pilot an energy efficiency mortgage. Why is that important? In Europe, it's a 7 trillion euro market. Equates to about half of EU GDP, if I'm not incorrect. The mortgage is the most well-known, lowest-cost form of property finance. It's not innovative. Build into what we've got, I think, is a really key message from us. And I think that point we've heard about, this more holistic view on sustainability, sometimes it's a bit woolly. What does that mean? We've talked a bit about life cycle costing. How do you produce assets that are just better over time for all the stakeholders they're supposed to serve? The Levels initiative that was mentioned earlier, I think is a really fantastic initiative led by the Commission to actually define what does sustainable building mean beyond just energy. So life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, importantly tackling embodied energy, not just operating carbon. Resource efficiency, water efficiency, health and comfort, because buildings are for people. Resilience, and life cycle cost and value, because these assets have to perform. It's a voluntary tool, but I think we should be creating a political momentum behind it to actually look at those areas, how you improve performance, and embed that both in industry best practice and public sector policy now to actually scale up that understanding of what are better performing buildings. So that's a key initiative that we're getting behind to look at some of these wider issues.
That's extremely helpful, and it's useful to know the kind of measures that are being taken on board or developed. But when you talk about incentivizing people through their money, through the pocket, so on the one hand, you've got people who are at the demand side, and you're tackling that through the mortgage. I mean, there's a huge capital flow there. But in terms of the supply side, what are the financial instruments you're engaging into actually kind of, when you think about the 4.6 trillion and only 10% going into energy efficiency, you need to use your lever of capital or sanction in some way to drive a different economic behavior. And it occurs to me there must be financial instruments that tackle the kind of supply side as much as the demand side.
My personal view is actually I work with a network of around 50,000 companies across the world that a lot of our members are ready to go and ready to invest. The demand side is where we're working. Institutional investors, where actually finance is provided to consumers at points in time where they're making decisions, is where we're trying to actually place our focus in terms of scaling up what is provided to the clients of the companies that we work with.
So you're saying it's kind of all rosy in the garden of the private sector investment side?
Sorry?
You're saying that the private sector investment side is all rosy, that people are up for it?
Not totally rosy globally.
Right.
I think in Europe, a lot of the companies that we're working with
Right.
would like to scale their manufacturing capacity or are doing, actually, in terms of demand and that renovation rate going up. One of the major barriers is provision of finance at a good rate to consumers so that they can do these works. So that's where we're focused, and I think there's a role for public incentives. In the UK, we're having a conversation about the main transaction tax, stamp duty, land tax, and how that changes there can actually get the consumer to start to think, actually, I am incentivized to look at, should I get a green mortgage? What do I need to do to qualify for that? How can I procure either a more efficient property or actually drive the market for energy efficient renovation because I want to procure works that will benefit my purse? So I think there's for me, actually interventions.
It's at that side. So you're saying at the consumer side is the and demand
key.
side
That's
rather than.
That's absolutely where we're focused in terms of where we think the butterfly effect is.
Okay, and so that 10% that I've just described as being the only bit that's being spent in construction is more about the aptitude and capacity of the public sector to kind of incentivize active behaviour from the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, I should say, we do a lot of work around procurement. And actually how, you need good procurement standards to drive professionals to want to go into skills programs to help in building markets and scale. So actually, on the kind of the policy side, actually building some of these requirements, things like levels, and actually building these sustainability performance requirements into the procurement market is a way of starting to create scale, starting to create the need for investment, starting to create a reason why professionals would skill up. Because actually, often people just don't want to go do that course because they're not seeing the market for it. So I think that for us is a very key intervention that the public sector can be taking to actually build markets.
And have you come across anywhere where the notion of a social impact bond has been used as a financial vehicle to kind of create greater collaboration and incentivization from the public sector with the private sector on building greener buildings?
I don't have specific examples. Okay. I've read about the conversation in Sweden around how you actually look at renovation and regeneration and bundle up the impact of that and sell those off to social impact investors through raising social impact bonds. But I haven't worked with that project. Yes.
Okay, Piero?
Now I'm afraid to say we because I didn't say that Milan is too big to do too much better. But we are going to launch 2 social impact bonds in the next couple of months. One is related to a peri-urban area that is including the retrofitting of a market, where it was before like a food market, we become a community hub. On the community hub, so we make energy efficiency retrofitting, but also we will link it to social. And the other one is over the Expo. There is discussion ongoing, the Expo area, so where we had the General Expo 2015. The private company is Land Lease, that is now designing the master plan. They are considering to have a social impact bond as part of their total investment on that, to measure their impact, because they're going to be the area mind will be a human capital future area. So that's things.
That's good to know. Good to know. Good. It can be a useful financial vehicle in that respect. Colleagues, we've now had the contributions from the panel. I wanted to kind of engage you more in this conversation in the last 20 minutes that we have of this debate. So this is your opportunity to argue, disagree, or pose questions, or share your thoughts on this particular agenda. Gentlemen here right at the front. And please don't be shy, and also please do raise your hands because I'm finding it very difficult to see at the back. Gentleman here at the front.
Hi everyone, I'm Ugo Guarnacci, working at the European Commission, EASME, the agency in charge of managing different EU funding programs, including Horizon 2020. And my question is both to Judith and Piero. In particular, I was surprised that in a session devoted to investing, we actually talk a lot about finance, but not so much about funding. And my question for Judith and Piero was more on the devil advocate, because you both talk about the EU role more on the regulation, the need that we need to be more aligned, point taken. But what about, for instance, the 10 million that the EU is investing with Horizon 2020 project on Clever City, where Milan, together with London and Hamburg, will actually be cooperating together to foster urban resilience through nature-based solutions. I mean, we are doing a lot. I mean, maybe it's not enough, but we are doing a lot from different Commission services. I think sometimes you get this EU as a monolithic entity, but I think it would be nice to reflect upon funding, because at the funding level, within the subsidiarity principle, we are trying to push a lot the agenda that is allowing certain cities like Milan to foster more the urban resilience further.
We'll be sure that, I mean, when we are criticizing the Commission because we want to push more to have less paper on barriers and more investment on the ground. Because what makes the difference, and I can give you like the sharing cities example is a lighthouse. I was the project manager before, over 8 million euro of budget for the local consortium. The real budget, the real money for intervention was 2 million and a half, because then there is the audit, there is the meeting, there is blah blah blah, something. But what makes the impact is the 2 million and a half, because that makes real things. And we always discuss about barriers and modeling and things that is useful, but we should like rebalancing. We already seen this experience from the international cooperation in the last 50 years, if we want to go back on the other side. So I think that's things, but absolutely, I mean, from sharing city we moved to Clever. Clever, it's London and Milan was working in sharing city, now they're working on the Clever. We're going to make a new natural-based solution, green roof, vertical garden. So there's also the way for us to give the proof to the political level and to the community what does it mean natural-based solution? Because if you try to translate in Italian, you cannot translate in Italian natural-based solution, MBS. And you go like to a grandmother and say, oh, I'm doing an MBS. She's looking and say, I'm looking for social housing, not for MBS. So the Commission is giving us the opportunity to work on a district, to make a business case, a business models at the end, and with the funding we can move into financial. So that's what we really appreciate. But if we want to advocate, I will ask that, because the Horizon 2020, the research, the DG research will increase their budget in the new budget. So increase also the rate of infrastructures investment linking to research and reduce the amount of maybe traveling, because if you want to be sustainable, maybe we should travel a bit less, for example, and or other costs, and work on the real infrastructure. That makes more concrete. That's my
yeah, just a kind of...
no, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back to you, because I can see you... No, please do. No, keep hold of my... Because I can see your face, and clearly that's not answering your question. What is it? What's the heart of what you're trying to say?
I mean, I'm trying to say that when you say alignment, a key requirement of that call was to leverage the investment with other EU funding, because we have the LIFE program doing half of what you're saying about forests, and we have the structural fund that should allow you to have more on infrastructure. So I think that, you know, when you say alignment, alignment doesn't go only for words, alignment that also goes for funding. And one thing that I want to say also, we are changing wording a lot. You mentioned behavioral change. Behavioral change was, I think, mentioned 4 or 5 times in the call where you responded. And, you know, so there are, I'm not just saying that we are perfect, but I just want to say that sometimes it's very easy when, at the same time that we ask to do barriers, to just criticize the monolithic entity as a funding.
Let's make, okay, I can get back, so I will go directly to the point. So I'll make the difference around London and Milan. London, the GLA, the Great London Authority, until they are in the European Union, they are managing an authority of the structural fund.
Yes.
So they are using the funding from the Horizon 2020, then they have London and partners, and London, funding London, that have created funds of fund to improve and to scaling and to leverage the investment fund. Well, when you come to Milan, we even not have access to structural fund because we are not a managing authority. This year, for the first time, and since the European Union was built, that we have access to social inclusion structural fund, but all the other budgets are coming to the regional government. So if we are speaking about cities, every city in Europe has a different access to the leverage. And then if we go to another, the DG Regio is delivering this multi-level governance structure, financial instruments that are supporting us. So we have the European Investment Bank working with us. The European Investment Bank is basically coming to us, say, we give you debt, And we say, we cannot, because the European Commission say us that we cannot grant debt. So how we can make debt over social housing if there is another route that we can make it? So when we speak about leverage, we can go deeply into the discussion, and this could take longer discussion. What I think that what we look is the city want to become a real heart of the future of Europe. We should have set rules when we can get really direct access to the structural fund.
Yeah, I sort of agree with you, but often, and I know this well, that when, because I worked with the GLA 8 years ago when this was all happening, and reality is that cities are the data that often reaches the funding from the European Union, because actually in any regional fund it's where you have the volume of people that are impacted, and it's the city that's going to be where you have to be able to be the part that demonstrates the value. Even if it's pan-regional, it's actually going to come to you in terms of establishing value and benefit. So I don't want you to respond to it, but I think there is issues about actually, if you think about politics and governance, there are ways in which you can actually work at a pan level but also at city level to make that happen, because actually the numbers count. Judith, before I come back to you, we have just one question which I think is related. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think UN Environment, Kirilika, I think one thing which is important, what you said is leadership. I'd like to ask you, because I believe if we want to show to the world that it's possible, we need to lead by example. We need to show that investing in a greener urban future is possible. I'd like to ask each of you to tell me which city in the 4 different continents you choose. You will, Piero, have to choose outside of Europe, otherwise you will promote Milan. But in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in America, Latin America, which are the cities of tomorrow where we will show that investing in a greener future is possible? I mean, we've been in Shenzhen, in China. We see the changes happening in some of the cities in China. Where can we show to the people in those 4 continents that greener urban future is possible?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. It was a lovely one to end on, actually. But I'm going to come back to you in a second. So I want Judith to respond to the issue that was raised about funding and alignment of funding, and how do you create greater value, given that actually you do have a range of things that come into a city or a region, and it's often up to the municipality or the regional governance structure to align that more effectively.
Yes, and so just going back to the funding itself, so from the architect's perspective, you need a much more joined up targeting of investment between the various ministries. So again, DG Culture working with DG Environment, working with DG Energy and DG Growth together to set out what it is exactly that you want to see happening on the ground. The purpose of funding, so the biggest, again, we're talking about barriers, but the purpose of funding is to reduce the hassle factor. Everything new and everything different that you try, people know how to do it, but there is a hassle factor attached to it, which has a cost attached to it. So any project that can somehow remove or overcome that hassle factor with anything clever and interesting needs to get that kind of support. For example, if you take retrofit, we talked about the piecemeal approach to retrofit, or the overall or funding and overall functional retrofit of a building, which the efficient use of resources is a formative part of. So you cannot get the good reduced rate funding unless it applies to the whole of your retrofit, and if you can prove that you have achieved those targets in use, then you should be eligible for extremely preferential rates of funding. There are certain, we call it the hassle factors associated with that, which are still huge. And so we need to be extremely innovative, and we need a very clear idea from the Commission's overall, an agreement between the different ministries on how to tackle that. And I think that's really essential. And I think the Commission has a huge responsibility to follow up on that and not let it become a piecemeal activity by just creating more tick box exercises. Change has to be meaningful. It has to involve social, cultural, economic, and environmental and resource issues.
Indeed. As ever, this will require political leadership.
And there needs to be an overarching, and I'm very pleased again to hear that in Milan that you're creating a kind of marketing department, but it's somehow the dissemination of success, which is not just collecting and analyzing the data that you gather from these success projects, but also promoting the ideas. And it needs clear leadership.
Indeed. Okay, before I come back to you, all of you with that question about the cities that you would choose, the cities that are the pathfinders, they are the ones that are shining the torch on the future. I'm going to give you one last opportunity if anybody has a burning question, and then I'll end with that final question, actually. Lady in front. There's a mic running its way to you. Great. Again, say who you are and who you represent.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Maya Hennison from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I have a creative question. So I noticed there's a lot of a new movement around community crowdfunding and cooperative, ownership models. So for example, in the city of Copenhagen, if you're a citizen, you have the opportunity to co-own some of the energy production that's happening within the municipality. And I was just wondering, how viable that ownership model is also for other types of projects that happens within the city. So for example, if you are refurbishing the building stock or something else, is it interesting to look at whether citizens can actually start to finance some of that and then get benefit from those improvements?
Very good question. Because there's a movement about commons in particular, especially in Scandinavia, but also it's emerging across Europe. But there is that kind of sense of how do you create? Can we use mutuality, which is ultimately what it is, mutuality as a driver for this particular agenda? Any comments or views? Anyone wants to address this?
Can I say a specific example?
Sorry?
Can I say a specific example?
Yes, please do.
That I'm aware of in the UK? So the idea of the Community Land Trust project, someone else was asking about housing. When you take the land cost out of the cost of housing, suddenly housing is not so expensive. And this is a really important point in the discussion when increasing amounts of public land is being transferred over to private developers. When you look at the community land trust model, effectively you buy into ownership of the land as long as you live there, but you basically cover the cost of the housing only in terms of investment, and you contribute to the well-being of the community to an agreed set of standards. And it's been shown to be extremely productive and positive. And we believe that actually it's not that there isn't enough housing, it is that the cost of housing is inflated because of the speculation on land cost, actually. And so these are kind of fundamental questions for municipalities, to what extent they choose to support different models of investment.
And actually, I think the community land trust model, is one, but there are many ways in which that opportunity is being created. It's almost like a renaissance model, in fact, in that. But what it does require is governments to say, or local governments to say, this piece of land I'm not going to create commercial value on, but actually I'm going to have it make social good and social purpose and invest in the long term. And that also requires...
also for funders to provide funding to projects like that,
and
because
foundations
they assess
are key
risk
to some
in
of
a
this.
completely different way than...
Yeah. James, and I'll bring you in now.
I'd love to speak after the session on this. I'm going to take my professional hat off a bit, put a personal one on, but I'd be surprised if that isn't one of the major disruptive forces, actually crowdfunding in the property sector for development and redevelopment. And I think the US is strides ahead, actually, of Europe in terms of actually creating a financial system and a regulatory environment to allow the growth of that sector. There's been quite a bit. I only really know about the UK alternative finance sector, but property is the big growth area, actually, and structurally that's something we really ought to be looking at, because I think that is actually where there's a lot of interest and actually quite a bit of capital in some cities that could be unlocked using those models for this sort of project.
You're absolutely right, but it's not just the UK. So you have in the Netherlands a community land trust approach and the commons approach. In Paris, they last year launched their first community land trust. It's kind of a burgeoning movement that's happening across many cities, and I think are part of the resilient cities as well, actually, but they are using the land trust model that I'm aware of in mainland Europe in earnest. I'm going to come to Raf first before I come to you.
Yeah, just this question about affordability of housing. I think this is interesting. I don't think that energy efficiency is a big factor there. It's really about bringing affordable housing in the center of the city and in the center of the urban policy. And the benefits generated by that are huge, or in terms of integration, in terms of mixing different functions. So I think we should not focus too much there on the cost of the additional cost related to energy efficiency, which I think is minimal to the benefits that will be generated. On the question of cities, Yes, I think this is a very good question, but I find it always interesting that you find cities with extremely good initiatives everywhere. You find Pune in India related to sustainable social housing, Chicago in the States on climate policy. You find Chengdu in China on more the city region planning, Durban on ecosystem protection, Kigali on environmental pollution. You see, most cities, there are very many cities with very good entry points, with very good successes, but you don't find many cities that bring it all together. And maybe that's the beauty of it. There's always work to be done, and it is a continuous agenda. You're never finished in making a city sustainable. It's work for the long haul.
No, indeed, your point is well made. But there's something about actually who are the, which are the kind of drivers of change you can point to and actually learn from, which is always a useful exercise. And also, it'd be great to have a global dashboard on practice around this, which something which you guys or others might be thinking of, to actually create that kind of level of awareness about who's doing what and who are the drivers and who are the kind of real movers and shakers on this agenda. Judith, I will come to Pierre, but I want to finish this session with the cities. The question, which are the ones that, are marked from your perspective, where you see it's like really happening?
I think I'm torn, so maybe I'll pass.
Oh, no. You can't pass, I'm sorry. You're not a politician, my dear, so you have to answer that question.
Not yet.
Hey, good luck to that. But no, say, I mean, you're amongst friends. It's not widely reported, only live streamed. It's all right. No one will tell. Or say both that you're torn about.
So I'm torn about initiatives that work well nationally, like in France, for example, targeting operational performance better, and how that manifests in different cities, or actually looking at the cultural regeneration of cities that is working extremely well, and perhaps then lacking the focus on the resource efficiency. So I think what we want is exactly what you're saying, that a more integrated approach from cities that look at the cultural, or effectively make the resource efficient approach a caveat of investment in social infrastructure, social and actual infrastructure.
You're going to make a really good politician. You ducked that question so well. Well done. Well done. We got France out of you, but the rest of it didn't work. But great. Now I'm only being funny. But you've very good political response. Piero, over to you.
I would say Athens, Lisbon, and Cape Town.
Why?
Athens, because it was capable to become sustainable in a time of economical crisis. It was terrible ever happened in a city. So without the lack of funding, the lack of money, they were capable to improve their social inclusion, to reconnect people, and the use of public spaces for inclusion and sustainability. And still suffering a crisis of migrants, not like other parts of Europe, there is real impact on that, and they are making out of that a big opportunity to rethink the public space. So Athens, for me, it's on the top on this. Cape Town was like a city that was moving during the last 20 years after like a stranger time, let's say, like that, moving again. And they are one of the bigger cities, the most infrastructure cities, suffering the impact of climate change now, not in 20 and 30 years, and have to deal with. So that's it. Lisbon is a friend cities, but Lisbon is it's booming in terms of attractiveness, it's booming in terms of design, and they are working a lot on the social housing, integrating the environmental, without speaking about environment, climate change, and even Athens and Lisbon, both of that, with a lot of funding and a time when there was a lot of limitation on this. Just to come back, only a really short answer to the crowdfunding initiative, and maybe because they are the Green Week, and because it's become sustainable, we have launched, because it's been an experience, a sharing garden, because we didn't have fund. We spent 50 cents for square meters for green. We don't have so much money to spend on green. So to improve the greening, and we have the maintenance cost, we have launched these sharing gardens, so people taking care of the green areas. It's something that is peculiar. It's around Europe, there are a lot of experience. Then we have the participatory budget launch, and last year, for the participatory budget, 1/3 of the project were asking for community garden, for sharing garden. So it becomes something that we launched 5 years ago, and then become a practice that people want to push more, asking for that. So that is also, I think, is a good experience in managing the public space and the community, as the US did.
Excellent, thank you. James, last but not least.
Because I work in Europe, I'm going to say somewhere outside of Europe. Vancouver, extremely ambitious green building strategy, and a deputy mayor who is really convinced it has to be led by citizen engagement. Really impressive stuff happening there. I think Rotterdam is a city that impresses me for the kind of building renovation economy and all the work that's going on there. And I'll just plug, in June, when around 20 major financial institutions launch a Europe-wide energy efficiency mortgage program, where there's actually one city is looking to throw their hat into the ring alongside the banks to join forces. So I'm going to not say who they are now until the middle of June. So I'll leave that.
We won't tell anybody, James. We won't tell anybody. Okay, all right. Great. That sounds like a good initiative, though. I think that to pull that off in terms of the kind of consumer side of the mortgage, it's an interesting breakthrough and a useful breakthrough. Colleagues, all good things come to an end. Time is up. I need to let you go. It's 6 o'clock. Just past 1 minute past. Thank you for being here, and also I hope that we've been able to enable you to connect the dots on this particular agenda, and you felt that we've debated some of the right issues that actually concern how we progress this particular issue of sustainable housing and investment, and try and think about, as we leave this auditorium, about the kind of change in practice and mindset and policy making that we need to actually deliberate and consider in the future. Thank you all very much. Let's thank our speakers in the usual way. Thank you very much. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of Green Week. Thank you very much.